There are nightmares that even the Imperium dares not speak aloud. Scenarios so horrific, so unthinkable, that they exist only in the darkest corners of probability, where the cruel mathematics of an infinite galaxy occasionally align in ways that defy all reason and mercy. This is the story of one such nightmare. Not a tale that has been told, but one that could be told. A possibility that lurks in the vast darkness between the stars, waiting for the precise convergence of catastrophe and chaos that would bring it into terrible being. Imagine, if you will, the most perfect warrior the Emperor ever created. Not a space marine, transcendent though they are, not even a primarch, godlike though they were. No, I speak of the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, the golden guardians who stand eternal vigil over the master of mankind himself. Each custodian is a work of art, a masterpiece of genetic engineering that makes even the Astartes look like rough sketches in comparison. Where a space marine is mass-produced from gene seed and recruits, enhanced and trained to become superhuman, a custodian is handcrafted. Their very genes are rewritten at the cellular level, their bodies and minds sculpted by arts that only the Emperor himself truly understood. They are to space marines what space marines are to ordinary mortals. Now imagine one of these golden demigods, already fallen once in service to the throne, broken so utterly that even their phenomenal resilience cannot restore them. Their body is ruined beyond the considerable powers of the Emperor's chirurgeons to heal. But their mind, that terrible, brilliant, perfectly honed instrument of war, remains sharp and undimmed. In their final moments, they are given a choice, though it is no choice at all for one who has dedicated every fiber of their being to the protection of humanity. They can rest at last, their duty ended, their service complete. Or they can continue. They can be sealed within an armored sarcophagus, their broken flesh sustained by ancient technology, their consciousness merged with a walking war machine that will allow them to fight on for centuries, perhaps millennia, until nothing remains but a ghost of who they once were. Most choose to fight on. For a custodian, only in death does duty truly end, and sometimes not even then. These are the custodian dreadnoughts, walking nightmares clad in golden auramite, mounting weapons that can level fortifications and protected by shields that can turn aside artillery shells. Each one contains not just centuries of tactical knowledge, but the living consciousness of one who once walked the halls of the imperial palace, who perhaps stood in the physical presence of the Emperor himself. They sleep in stasis deep within the vaults of terror, awakened only when the need is most dire, when even the formidable might of the active custodes proves insufficient. And now, in this thought experiment of horror, imagine one of these fallen heroes torn from their long sleep, not by the reverent hands of their brothers, but by the crude, green-skinned paws of Orks. Imagine the Emperor's finest warrior, already condemned to an existence of endless battle, interrupted only by dreamless sleep, awakening to find themselves in the custody of the galaxy's most destructive and unpredictable race. A warrior bred to perfection, fallen into the hands of beings who barely understand the concept, who view the universe through a lens of violence so pure that even death is just another excuse for a good scrap. This is not a tale of triumph. There are no heroes here, no clean victories, no moments of redemption. This is grim dark at its purest, a collision between the Imperium's greatest perfection and the Orks' savage enthusiasm. And the result is a nightmare that neither side could have anticipated. It is a scenario that speaks to the fundamental horror of existence in the 41st millennium, where even the mightiest can fall, where even the most sacred can be profaned, where the only constant is war, and the only mercy is that eventually, finally, all things end. But before we descend into that darkness, before we examine what happens when an immovable object of imperial might meet the irresistible force of Orkish curiosity, we must first understand the players in this grim drama. We must understand what a Custodian Dreadnought truly is, what it means to be entombed in such a machine, and what manner of being the Orks really are beneath their savage exterior. Only then can we grasp the full horror of this encounter, the cruel irony of a guardian reduced to a trophy, a masterwork transformed into a curiosity, and a warrior without equal forced to confront an enemy that doesn't even understand the concept of surrender. Welcome to the nightmare. Welcome to the story of when Orks capture a sleeping Custodian Dreadnought, the Golden Tomb. Understanding Custodian Dreadnoughts. To understand the true horror of this scenario, we must first understand what a Custodian Dreadnought represents, both as a weapon and as a tragedy. These are not simply larger versions of the Dreadnoughts deployed by Space Marine chapters, any more than a Custodian is simply a larger Space Marine. They are something altogether different, forged by technologies that predate the Imperium itself, housing warriors whose equal has not been seen since the dark days of the Horus heresy. The most common patterns of Custodian Dreadnought are ancient beyond measure: the Contemptor Achilles, the Contemptor Galatus, the massive Telemon Heavy Dreadnought. All of these designs date back to the Great Crusade, to a time when the Emperor still walked among his creations, and the Imperium was young and full of terrible purpose. They were built not by the Adeptus Mechanicus, with their ritual-bound construction and prayer-laden assembly, but by the artificers of the imperial court itself, craftsmen whose skills were honed in the creation of war gear fit for demigods. Every component is handcrafted. Every system is optimized to a degree that would make even a Magos weep with envy. The auramite armor that sheathes them is stronger than ceramite, more resilient than adamantium, its golden surface etched with protective wards and molecular bonding fields that can withstand punishment that would reduce a standard dreadnought to molten slag. The weapons they mount are equally transcendent. A Galatus warblade that can cleave through a squad of Chaos Terminators with a single sweep. An Arachnus storm cannon that fires coherent beams of energy capable of punching through the armor of super-heavy tanks. Iliastus accelerator culverins that spit hyper-accelerated rounds at velocities that defy conventional physics. But the technology, magnificent though it is not what makes a Custodian Dreadnought truly terrible. It is the warrior inside. Custodians do not die easily. Their bodies are created to endure punishment that would liquefy a Space Marine. Their regenerative capabilities so profound that they can recover from wounds that would be fatal to almost any other being. The Custodian who is interred within a Dreadnought has not simply been wounded, they have been destroyed. Perhaps they took a plasma blast to the chest that vaporized their torso, leaving only their head and fragments of their spine. Perhaps they were caught in a catastrophic explosion that reduced their body to ash while their helmet preserved their brain. Perhaps they held a breach alone against a demonic incursion, their body torn apart by warp-spawned horrors even as they refused to yield a single step. Whatever the cause, what remains is not enough to sustain life, even by the standards of Custodian physiology. And so they are brought to the deep vaults, to the sacred chambers where the Dreadnoughts wait in silent rows, their golden shells gleaming in the dim light of preservation fields. The Custodian's remains are carefully extracted, reduced to the absolute minimum required to sustain consciousness. All unnecessary flesh is stripped away. What is left is horrific to behold. A torso reduced to its core components, organs floating in nutrient solution, a brain encased in life support systems. Perhaps fragments of a face still recognizable through the mass of cables and augmetics that sustain what little organic matter remains. This grotesque remnant is then sealed within the armored sarcophagus at the heart of the Dreadnought. Neural interfaces pierce what remains of the brain, connecting the warrior's consciousness to the machine's systems. Sensory feeds replace eyes and ears. Targeting cogitators become their perception. The Dreadnought's limbs become their body. It is a transformation so complete, so total, that what emerges is something that exists in the space between flesh and machine, neither fully alive nor truly dead. And for a custodian, this is perhaps the cruelest fate imaginable. Understand that custodians are not like space marines. An Astartes knows brotherhood, fights as part of a unit, lives among his battle brothers, and draws strength from their camaraderie. A custodian is fundamentally alone. They are trained from the moment of their creation as individuals, each one a complete warrior unto themselves, capable of independent action and personal judgment in ways that space marines are not. They are scholars as well as warriors, philosophers as well as soldiers. Their minds are as honed as their bodies, capable of appreciating art and music and literature, of engaging in political discourse and strategic planning at the highest levels. Now imagine such a being sealed in an armored coffin, their senses reduced to mechanical feeds, their body replaced by pistons and servos. Imagine them awakened from dreamless sleep, not to fight alongside their comrades in defense of something they believe in, but in some random battle on some forgotten world, animated for a few hours of violence before being shut down again and returned to darkness. Imagine the isolation, the sensory deprivation, the slow erosion of everything that makes them who they are. This is why custodian dreadnoughts are kept in the deepest vaults, why they are awakened only when absolutely necessary. Not because the technology is unreliable, though the knowledge of their construction has indeed been lost, and each one is irreplaceable. Not because they are unstable, though the mental strain of such existence can indeed drive even a custodian to the edge of madness, but because it is mercy of a sort. Every moment of consciousness is another moment of loss, another fraction of their humanity stripped away by the simple fact of existing in this state. When they are awakened, it is for battles of supreme importance, the defense of the imperial palace itself, the reclamation of artifacts of the Great Crusade, missions where failure is not an option, and the price of victory is measured not in lives, but in the survival of the Imperium itself. They are deployed with all the reverence their sacrifice deserves, treated with the honor due to fallen heroes who have given more than their lives in service to the Emperor. And in battle, they are absolutely devastating. A custodian dreadnought is not simply a walking tank. It is the perfect fusion of the Emperor's finest warrior with technologies from an age when such perfection was the baseline. They move with a grace that seems impossible for something so massive, their atomantic shielding flickering as it turns aside incoming fire, their weapons speaking with a precision that reflects the consciousness guiding them. A squad of Chaos Space Marines is obliterated in seconds. A tank becomes a smoking ruin with a single shot. Enemy commanders are plucked from their bodyguards with targeting solutions calculated in microseconds. But it is not just their physical capabilities that make them formidable. It is their tactical acumen, their strategic insight, their ability to process the flow of battle and respond with decisions that take into account not just the immediate engagement, but the long-term implications for the war effort. A custodian, dreadnought, is not a blunt instrument to be pointed at the enemy. It is a force multiplier, a strategic asset, a commander as much as a combatant. And now, in our hypothetical nightmare, imagine one of these magnificent, tragic warriors falling into Ork hands. Imagine them lying dormant in their stasis chamber, their consciousness suspended in the darkness that has become their refuge from the pain of existence, completely unaware that they are no longer in the sacred vaults of terror, but in the crude workshop of a mech boy who sees them not as a fallen hero, but as a particularly interesting pile of scrap. The horror is multi-layered. There is the physical danger, certainly, the possibility of being torn apart by orcs who have no idea what they're dealing with, their sarcophagus breached and their fragile remains exposed to a hostile environment. There is the violation, the desecration of something sacred, a warrior who served at the Emperor's side reduced to an orc curiosity. And there is the existential dread, The nightmare of awakening not to the reverent tones of a fellow custodian and the data feeds of a sanctioned mission, but to the guttural shouts of greenskins and the realization that everything they are, everything they were, is now in the hands of the one enemy that might actually be capable of making their situation even worse. Because orcs, you see, are very good at making things worse. It's practically their defining characteristic. The Green Tide. Understanding orc psychology and technology. To understand what happens when orcs get their hands on a Custodian Dreadnought, we must first understand what orcs are, and more importantly, what they are not. They are not mindless savages, despite what Imperial propaganda might suggest. They are not simple brutes, though their preference for straightforward violence might give that impression. And they are certainly not incapable of sophisticated thought, though their thought processes follow pathways that no human mind would ever naturally tread. Orks are a bioengineered weapon species created by the ancient Old Ones during their war against the Necrontyr millions of years ago. They were designed to be the perfect soldiers, self-sustaining, self-replicating, impossible to completely eradicate, and psychologically incapable of fear or despair. Every orc emerges from the spores released by dead orcs with a baseline knowledge of how to fight, how to survive, and in some cases, how to build the crude but effective weapons they favor. This isn't learned behavior, it's genetic memory. Information encoded directly into their DNA and accessible on an instinctive level. This instinctive knowledge is most pronounced in the odd boys, specialized orcs, whose genetic programming gives them particular aptitudes. Pain boys understand surgery and anatomy. Weird boys channel the Gestalt psychic energy generated by other orcs. And mech boys, the orcs who will be the primary actors in our scenario, understand technology in a way that is fundamentally alien to how humans comprehend it. A mech boy doesn't learn to build. They don't study blueprints or master principles of engineering. They simply look at a pile of scrap and know, on a level they couldn't explain if they tried, how the pieces could fit together to create something functional. This knowledge isn't perfect or comprehensive. A mech couldn't tell you about tensile strength or thermal expansion or electromagnetic induction, but they can see a bit of exhaust pipe, a chunk of armor plating, and a handful of bolts, and their hands will move seemingly of their own accord, welding and riveting and hammering until what emerges is something that looks like it shouldn't work but absolutely does. And here's where it gets interesting. Orc technology does work, but not entirely for the reasons the mechs think it does. The Imperium's tech priests have theorized, and most Imperial scholars now accept, that Orc technology functions in part because of the Gestalt psychic field that all Orcs generate collectively. This field, commonly referred to as the collective surge, doesn't make reality completely malleable to Orc belief. That's a common misconception. But it does smooth over the rough edges of their engineering, making crude machines run more smoothly than they have any right to, allowing weapons to function when by all rights they should explode in the user's hands. This field is generated unconsciously by all Orcs, growing stronger as more Orcs congregate in one area and as they engage in their favorite activity, fighting. It's why Orc warbands become more dangerous as they grow larger, not just because of their numbers, but because the psychic resonance of so many Orcs together starts to affect reality itself in subtle but significant ways. Red vehicles really do go faster when Orcs are driving them. Bigger guns really do hit harder. More Daka really is better Daka, not just psychologically but physically, as the Orcs' collective belief in the superiority of overwhelming firepower actually manifests as improved performance. But, and this is crucial, the field has limits. Orcs can't just believe anything into existence. If a mech tried to make a gun by strapping a bent pipe to a stick and calling it a day, it wouldn't work, no matter how much they believed in it. The technology has to be at least conceptually sound, has to have the basic components required for function. The psychic field just ensures that slightly loose tolerances don't matter, that missing parts can be compensated for, that the whole ramshackle assemblage holds together long enough to be useful. This combination of instinctive engineering knowledge and reality-bending psychic reinforcement makes orcs terrifyingly effective at looting technology from other races. Mechs are fascinated by advanced tech, not because they understand it in any technical sense, but because they can see possibilities in it, potential uses that their instincts immediately grasp. An orc mech looking at an Imperial Lehman Russ tank doesn't see a sophisticated piece of military hardware with carefully calibrated systems. They see a great big gun, some thick armor, and tracks that make it move, and their mind immediately starts working on how to make it more orky, which invariably means adding more guns, more armor, more speed, and maybe painting it red, because red makes things go faster. The results of this process are the famous looted wagons, vehicles that were originally Imperial, Tau, or Eldar, now covered in scrap metal welding, additional weapons bolted on wherever they'll fit, and often sporting ramshackle additions that shouldn't work, but do, because enough orcs believe they will. A looted rhino might have twice as many guns as it originally mounted, armor plates scavenged from 3 different vehicles welded over the original hull, and an engine that's been cranked up to output levels that should cause it to explode but somehow don't, at least not right away. Orcs have looted everything from simple infantry transports to Imperial knights, those towering war machines piloted by noble houses. They've captured Eldar Grav vehicles and somehow kept them functioning despite the delicate nature of their anti-gravity systems. They've seized Tau battlesuits and repurposed them as walking gun platforms. If it's got weapons, armor, or an engine, orcs will try to loot it, and more often than not, they'll succeed in getting it working after a fashion. But here's what makes this scenario so horrifying. All of those examples involve vehicles, machines that are separate from their operators. Even an Imperial Knight, intimate as the connection between pilot and machine may be, is fundamentally a vehicle that can be disconnected from its pilot. A Dreadnought is different. A Dreadnought isn't piloted, it's inhabited. The warrior isn't controlling the machine from a cockpit. They are the machine, or as close to being the machine as it's possible to get, while still technically being alive. And a Custodian Dreadnought is even more integrated than a standard one. The neural interfaces are more sophisticated, the connection between flesh and machine more complete, the line between warrior and war machine more thoroughly blurred. When a mech boy starts poking around in a standard looted vehicle, the worst they can do is damage the machine. When they start poking around in a Dreadnought, they're effectively performing surgery on the pilot. Except the surgeon is an orc whose understanding of what they're doing is entirely instinctive, and who thinks that hitting something with a hammer is a perfectly valid troubleshooting technique. Oh, and there's one more thing we need to understand about orcs before we proceed to the main event. Orcs are not cruel in the way chaos is cruel, with deliberate malice and an understanding of the suffering they inflict. But they are also completely incapable of empathy with non-orcs. They don't understand pain as something to be avoided or inflicted strategically. They don't grasp the concept of psychological torment. If they're hurting someone, it's either because it's useful, like when pain boys perform their brutal surgeries, or because it's funny, like when they use Gretchen for target practice. This means that if an orc mech is working on a Custodian Dreadnought, and their poking around causes pain to the warrior inside, the mech won't stop because they feel bad about it. They probably won't even register that pain is being inflicted, and if they do notice through screams or thrashing or some other obvious sign, their response won't be compassion. It'll be curiosity about what exactly they did to cause that reaction, and whether doing it again will have interesting results. So as we move forward into our scenario, keep all of this in mind. The mechs aren't evil, at least not in any way they would understand. They're just orcs, following their instincts, trying to figure out how this amazing piece of technology works, and completely incapable of understanding that the golden machine they're so excited about contains a warrior who was already living a nightmare and is about to discover that nightmares can, in fact, get worse. The capture. How did we get here? Before we delve into the horror of what happens after the capture, we need to understand how such an impossible scenario could occur in the first place. Custodian dreadnoughts do not simply wander into Ork territory. They are precious beyond measure, kept in the most secure vaults on Terra, awakened only for battles of supreme importance, and always accompanied by entire shield companies of their active brothers. The logistics of a lone Custodian dreadnought falling into Ork hands require a perfect storm of catastrophe, a convergence of disasters so unlikely that it exists at the very edge of probability. But in a galaxy at war, where billions die every day, and entire civilizations are extinguished in moments, even the most improbable scenarios occasionally come to pass. Let us construct a plausible nightmare. Let us imagine a mission that brings a Custodian dreadnought far from Terra, into the kind of war zone where Orks thrive. The setting is the Sharadon sector, a region of space that has been contested between the Imperium and various Ork empires for millennia. In the wake of the Great Rift's opening, a massive surge of Ork forces has coalesced under a particularly cunning and brutal war boss, one whose green tide threatens to overrun dozens of Imperial worlds. The threat is assessed as existential, not just to the local sector, but potentially to the stability of the surrounding regions. Ork invasions have a tendency to snowball, each victory drawing more Orks to the victorious war boss's banner, until what started as a mere raid becomes an unstoppable tide. The Adeptus Custodes, already stretched thin by the countless threats facing the Imperium in the era of the Indomitus Crusade, dispatch a small force to eliminate the war boss before their surge can reach critical mass. The mission is surgical, precise. A single shield host, perhaps 50 custodians in total, inserted directly into the heart of the Ork Empire via a specially configured strike cruiser. With them goes a single venerable Contemptor dreadnought. Awakened from his long sleep because his tactical database contains extensive information on Ork warfare patterns, knowledge gathered over 3,000 years of intermittent consciousness. The strike goes as planned initially. The Custodians deploy with their characteristic overwhelming force, their guardian spears and sentinel blades carving through the Ork defenders with contemptuous ease. The war boss, for all their size and ferocity, is no match for even a single Custodian, much less a full shield host backed by a dreadnought whose weapons can level buildings. The mission appears to be a textbook success, and then everything goes wrong. Because while the Custodians were focusing on the war boss, assuming that decapitating the leadership would cause the Ork forces to fragment and turn on each other as usual, they failed to account for one critical factor. The war boss was not the only authority figure in this particular surge. There was also a big mech, one of those rare Orks, whose fascination with technology has elevated them to a position of authority rivaling even that of the greatest warriors. This mech had been working on something, a project so ambitious that even other Orks thought they were crazy, which for Orks is saying something. They had been building a weapon, not a gun, not a vehicle, but a proper superweapon, cobbled together from the wreckage of a dozen looted ships and powered by a jury-rigged reactor that shouldn't work but does because enough Orks believe it will. And just as the Custodians are preparing to extract, having achieved their objective and eliminated the war boss, the Big Mech activates their creation. What happens next is categorized in Imperial records as a localized spatial anomaly, though that's a polite way of saying that reality itself temporarily broke in a sphere roughly 50 kilometers in diameter. The mech's weapon tears a hole in space-time, not into the warp, but into some other dimension, some pocket of twisted physics where the normal rules don't apply. The effect lasts only seconds, but those seconds are enough. The Custodian's strike cruiser, positioned in low orbit for rapid extraction, is caught in the edge of the anomaly. Its Geller fields, designed to protect against warp incursions, are useless against this. The ship is pulled into the anomaly, then spat back out, but the process scrambles its systems, leaves it tumbling through space with its engines dead and its shields collapsed. The Custodians on the ground are more fortunate, if you can call it that. Most of them simply cease to exist, their atoms scattered across dimensions that have no names. A handful survive, though their golden armor is scorched and their weapons damaged. And the Custodian Dreadnought, sealed in his stasis-locked sarcophagus and shielded by layers of auramite and ancient protective wards, survives intact. His external systems are damaged, weapons offline and locomotives seized, but the sarcophagus itself is undisturbed. In his dreamless sleep, the ancient warrior doesn't even register that anything has happened. When the effects of the anomaly dissipate, the Orks cautiously emerge from their crude bunkers to survey the damage. The big mech is ecstatic. Their weapon worked. Sure, it also vaporized about half the Ork forces in the blast radius and turned the other half's teeth to glass, but it worked. And in the smoking crater where the war boss's fortress once stood, they find something that makes their mechboy heart race with excitement. A golden war machine, unlike anything they've ever seen before. Bigger than their own deaf dreads, but more refined, covered in armor that shimmers even when scorched and blackened by the anomaly's effects. Weapons that are clearly weapons, even though the mechs don't recognize the specific patterns. And most intriguing of all, a sense that this thing is somehow complete, not broken or damaged, despite the violence it was just subjected to. It's not a wreck to be scavenged. It's a prize to be claimed. The surviving custodians, numbering perhaps a dozen, attempt to retrieve their fallen brother. They fight with the desperation of those who know they cannot afford to fail, but they are outnumbered, their weapons damaged, their position untenable. The choice becomes stark: die fighting for the Dreadnought's recovery, and guarantee that its secrets fall into Ork hands, or withdraw, survive, and hope to mount a proper rescue mission once reinforcements arrive. They withdraw. It's the only tactically sound decision, even though it goes against every instinct they possess. A Custodian Dreadnought in Ork hands is a catastrophe, but a dozen Custodians dead, and the Dreadnought still captured is a catastrophe with no possibility of redemption. They retreat, fighting every step of the way, each one silently swearing oaths of vengeance and promising to return for their brother, no matter what it takes. But extracting a single Custodian Dreadnought from Ork territory is not a matter of sending in a retrieval team. It requires a full battle group, potentially multiple chapters of Space Marines, extensive planning, and resources that the Imperium can ill afford to commit when there are 10,000 other crises demanding attention. Days turn into weeks turn into months, and in that time, the Orks do what Orks do best. They start taking their prize apart to see how it works, and that's where our story truly begins. With a big mech staring at the sealed golden sarcophagus, surrounded by his lesser mech boys and a growing crowd of curious Orks, all of them trying to figure out what this amazing piece of technology actually is, and more importantly, how to make it go. The investigation. Mech boys at work. The workshop of a big mech is a place that would drive a tech priest to madness and likely cause a custodian to weep, though for very different reasons. It's a chaotic sprawl of scavenged technology, half-finished projects, and bits of machinery that serve no discernible purpose, but which the mech insists are vital. Sparks fly from welding torches operated by Gretchen, who barely understand which end of the torch to point away from themselves. Oil drips from leaky engines suspended from chains, and over it all hangs the distinctive smell of Orks at work. A mixture of promethium, ozone, burnt metal, and something organic that's better left unidentified. Into this organized chaos, the Orks have dragged their prize. The Custodian Dreadnought lies on its back, supported by a framework of girders and scrap metal, looking simultaneously majestic and violated. Despite the scorching from the spatial anomaly, the auramite armor still gleams with that characteristic golden sheen, refusing to tarnish even under layers of Ork grime and the attention of crude tools. The Dreadnought is, technically, intact. All of its major systems are present, its armor unbreached, its weapons still mounted though clearly non-functional. To the mechs, it's a puzzle box of unimaginable sophistication, and they are absolutely delighted. The big mech, whom we'll call Gricket Tinker's Mash for the sake of this narrative, is larger than most orcs, their frame made even more imposing by the various mechanical augmentations they've added to themselves over the years. A servo-assisted power claw where their right arm used to be. A crude bionic eye that occasionally sparks and whirs as it attempts to focus. Metal plating covering their skull, supposedly to protect the thinking bits, but more likely because they thought it looked impressive. They circle the Dreadnought like a scavenger bird examining a fresh corpse, occasionally reaching out to tap the armor with a wrench, just to hear the satisfying thunk it makes. "Right den, boys," Gricket rumbles, their voice the gravelly bass typical of larger orcs. "What we got here is a proper piece of kit, yeah? Look at that shiny armor, all glowing even when it's all sooty. That's good metal, that is. And see them guns? Dunno what they shoot, but they gotta shoot something impressive, yeah? We's gonna crack this thing open and see what makes it proper." The gathered mech boys, numbering perhaps 24, nod enthusiastically. They're a varied lot, from spanners barely out of their spore stage still learning the trade to grizzled old mechs, whose hands move with the surety of those who've built and rebuilt 1,000 weapons. All of them can feel it, that instinctive understanding that tells them this machine is special, that figuring out how it works will teach them things they didn't even know they wanted to know. The first challenge is simply understanding what they're looking at. Orc Death. Dreads are relatively simple, at least by orc standards. You've got an orc who's been smashed up too bad to fight proper, but who's too mean to die. You wire them into a big metal body. You give them lots of guns. You let them stomp around until something breaks, or they finally get killed for real. It's straightforward, brutal, and extremely orky. This golden machine is clearly not straightforward. For one thing, the armor is seamless in ways that orc welding could never achieve, each plate flowing into the next with no visible joints or weak points. The weapons are integrated into the arms rather than simply bolted on, and the mounting systems use technologies the mechs don't recognize, though their instincts tell them they could probably replicate the effect with enough hammering and liberal application of rivets. And most puzzling of all, there's no obvious way to open it up. Orc technology favors access panels held on with bolts, or in a pinch, just bits of metal welded over holes that can be pried open with a crowbar. This Dreadnought has no such conveniences. The armor plates are locked in place with some kind of molecular bonding field that the mechs can sense but not see, and trying to force them apart just makes the material resist harder. It's frustrating in the way that a really good puzzle is frustrating, making the mechs more determined rather than less. "We's gonna need to be clever about this," Gricket announces, which for an orc is a deeply unusual statement. Orcs prefer the direct approach, but even they can recognize when brute force might damage something they want to keep intact, at least until they understand it better. "Sparkplug, go get the buzzer, the big one. We's gonna try cutting through this shiny stuff, but careful like. Don't want to wreck the good bits before we see what they do." Sparkplug, a younger mech distinguished by having more fingers than most orcs on account of not having blown any off yet, scurries off to retrieve the requested tool. In orc terms, a buzzer is a circular saw, though these particular specimens are powered by oversized engines and make a sound like metal screaming its last. The one Sparkplug returns with is particularly impressive, its blade a full meter across and spinning at velocities that make the air shimmer around it. Gricket takes the buzzer, tests its weight, and then carefully, almost delicately by orc standards, brings the blade down against the Dreadnought's shin armor. The blade shrieks, sparks fountain in all directions, and the gathered orcs cheer in appreciation of the light show. But when Gricket pulls the buzzer away, the armor is unmarked, not even scratched. The Auramite's molecular structure has resisted the assault, as if it were no more threatening than a gentle breeze. "Well," Gricket says after a moment of consideration, "that's proper tough, that is. Impressive like. But everything's got a weak spot, yeah? Just gotta find it." What follows is several hours of what could charitably be called examination, and more accurately described as increasingly creative attempts to breach the Dreadnought's armor. The mechs try cutting from different angles. They try drilling. They try using a plasma torch that burns hot enough to melt through tank armor, though all it does to the Dreadnought is make the golden surface glow slightly brighter. One enterprising young mech suggests using explosives, which everyone agrees is a great idea, right up until Gricket points out that blowing up their prize defeats the purpose of having captured it in the first place. Throughout all of this, the Custodian sleeps on, unaware. The stasis field that cocoons his consciousness is absolute, a bubble of frozen time that protects him from external stimuli. The sarcophagus is designed to survive catastrophic damage to the Dreadnought's outer shell, to keep its precious cargo alive and intact, even if everything else is destroyed. The Orks' attempts, violent as they are, don't even register. He dreams the dreams of the stasis-locked, which is to say he experiences nothing at all, floating in a void where time has no meaning and sensation does not exist. But while the outer armor proves impervious to the mech's efforts, they are learning. Each failed attempt teaches them something. The armor is toughest at the joints, where overlapping plates provide multiple layers of protection. The weapon systems have their own independent power sources, suggesting they can operate even if the main reactor is damaged. And most intriguingly, there's a pattern to the armor's resistance. It's not uniform. Certain areas, particularly around what the mechs correctly identify as sensor nodes and data ports, are slightly less reinforced than others. "Right," Gricket says, stepping back and wiping lubricant from their power claw. "We's approaching this all wrong. This ain't like chopping into a tank. This is more like, what's the word, delicate-like. We gotta think like one of them fiddly mechs, the ones what fix things instead of smashing them." This is, for an Ork, revolutionary thinking. But big mechs are big mechs precisely because they can sometimes override their instinct for direct action with actual planning. Gricket directs the mechs to examine the Dreadnought more carefully, looking for access points, maintenance hatches, anything that might give them a way in without having to breach the main armor. And eventually, they find it. On the Dreadnought's back, shielded by the bulk of the body and almost invisible beneath layers of ceremonial scrollwork and purity seals, there's a data port. It's tiny by Ork standards, barely larger than a Gretchen's thumb, and its purpose isn't immediately obvious. But to the mech's instinctive understanding, it's clearly an interface point, a place where external systems can connect to the Dreadnought's internal network. "That's it," Gricket breathes, something like reverence in their voice, which is deeply unnerving for anyone familiar with Orks. "That's the way in. We can't break through the armor, so we's gonna talk to it instead. Get me some cables, boys. The good ones, not the ones what catch fire. We's gonna see if we can wake this thing up." The mechs scramble to comply, returning with spools of cables scavenged from a dozen different sources: Imperial power lines, Tau data cables, Elder fiber optics, Ork-made wiring that looks like it's held together more by hope and rust than any actual engineering principle. Gricket selects a handful that look like they might fit the port, or can be made to fit with sufficient hammering, and begins the delicate work of establishing a connection. This is where the Ork gestalt field becomes both blessing and curse. The mechs genuinely don't understand the protocols they're attempting to interface with. They're working entirely on instinct, connecting things because they feel like they should connect, routing power through pathways that make sense to their Ork engineering sensibilities, even if they would give a proper tech priest heart palpitations. And because enough Orks are gathered around believing that this should work, because the collective psychic field is saying, yes, this is right, this will function, it actually does start to function. Power flows. Data connections stabilize. And deep within the Dreadnought, systems that have been dormant begin to wake. The first sign that something is happening is subtle. The Dreadnought's optical sensors, dark and lifeless for weeks, suddenly emit a faint golden glow. It's barely visible in the harsh light of the workshop, but the mechs notice immediately their heads turning in unison to stare at the awakening machine. "It's working," Sparkplug whispers, which for an orc is the equivalent of a human screaming in excitement. "Boss, it's actually working! You did it!" Gricket doesn't respond. They're watching the Dreadnought with an expression that, on an orc's brutal features, might almost be mistaken for apprehension. Because they're starting to realize that they might have made a mistake. Not in the sense that what they're doing is wrong. Orcs don't really do moral reflection like that. But in the sense that they might have just woken something up that they're not prepared to deal with. The optical sensors brighten further. Status runes that the orcs don't understand, but which their instincts tell them are important, begin to activate along the Dreadnought's armor. And somewhere deep inside the machine, in the sealed sarcophagus, where a fragment of a warrior has slept for subjective centuries, consciousness begins to return. The Custodian is waking up, and they are very, very far from home. The awakening. Consciousness returns to nightmare. For the Custodian, the awakening is not instantaneous. Stasis sleep does not release its grip all at once. Instead, consciousness returns in layers, each one bringing with it new inputs, new sensory data, new awareness of the world beyond the sarcophagus. It's a process that normally takes minutes under controlled conditions, with tech priests monitoring every vital sign and Custodian handlers ready to provide orientation briefings the moment the warrior is fully aware. This is not a controlled awakening. The first sensation is always the same, for any Dreadnought emerging from stasis. The awareness of the amniotic fluid filling what remains of the lungs, the thick, cold liquid that sustains the fragile remnants of organic tissue. It's deeply unpleasant, a sensation that the brain interprets as drowning, even though intellectually the warrior knows that this fluid is keeping them alive. Ancient instincts scream suffocation, demand that the lungs expel this foreign substance, but there's no longer any mechanism for doing so. The fluid is permanent, as much a part of the Dreadnought's life support as the neural cables that pierce the skull. Then comes the connection. The neural interface is activating, one by one, linking the warrior's consciousness to the Dreadnought's systems. Vision returns, but it's not sight in the way a living being would understand it. It's data, processed through targeting cogitators and Auspex sensors, translated into something the organic brain can comprehend. The workshop resolves in the Custodian's perception. Though it appears wrong, the color's off, the perspective's skewed, because they're seeing through optics designed for machine logic rather than human neurology. Hearing follows, though again it's distorted. The voices of the orcs are picked up by acoustic sensors and run through translation matrices, the machine attempting to make sense of the guttural orcish language, and failing because its databases don't include any entry for greenskin dialects. What reaches the Custodian's consciousness is noise, meaningless sound that their highly trained mind nevertheless begins to parse, recognizing patterns even if specific meanings elude them. Proprioception is perhaps the strangest sensation of all. The awareness of the Dreadnought's body as if it were their own body, the weight of the armor, the position of the limbs, currently splayed at awkward angles on the support framework, the integrity status of the weapons systems, reporting as damaged, offline, non-functional. All of this floods into a brain that still remembers having hands, having legs, having a body made of flesh and bone, rather than pistons and ceramite. Most Dreadnoughts are given time to adjust to this sensory overload, to reconcile what they're experiencing with what they remember and what they know. But this Custodian doesn't have that luxury, because as higher cognitive functions come online, as the warrior's mind begins to actively process their surroundings rather than simply receive data, they become aware of two deeply alarming facts. First, nothing they're perceiving matches the expected pattern for an awakening on Terra. The environment is wrong, the sounds are wrong. The figures moving around them, visible now as heat signatures and mass readings, are definitely, absolutely, horrifyingly wrong. Because those figures are orcs. The Custodian doesn't need translation software to recognize that. The physiological profiles are unmistakable. Greenskins, Xenos, the enemy. And second, more terrifying than the first, they are completely helpless. The Dreadnought's weapons are offline. The locomotor systems are locked in place. Whether by damage or deliberate restraint, the warrior can't tell. Even the basic defensive systems, the atomantic shields that should activate automatically in the presence of threat, remain stubbornly dormant. They are awake, aware, and utterly unable to act. It's a custodian's nightmare made manifest, the warrior who was bred to be the apex predator, reduced to the status of prey, conscious but powerless as the enemy swarms around them. The custodian attempts to activate combat protocols. Their mind, trained through centuries of battle and refined by genetic engineering that makes even space marine conditioning look crude, moves through the familiar pathways. Check weapons status, assess tactical situation, identify primary threats, engage. But every command is met with the same response: systems offline, locomotors locked, weapons disabled. They are a consciousness trapped in an unresponsive shell, a mind sealed in metal that refuses to obey. And then, making the situation infinitely worse, one of the Orks notices that the optical sensors are active. Gricket leans in close, their brutal face filling the custodian's vision, and grins a grin made terrifying by the sheer number of teeth it reveals. "Oi," the big mech says, their voice booming through the acoustic sensors. "I think we woke it up, boys. Look at them glowy lights, all active like. That's good, that is. Means we's doing something right." The custodian tries to speak, to activate the vocal synthesizers that should allow them to communicate. But like everything else, those systems are locked out, non-responsive. They can see the Ork leering at them. They can hear the excited chatter of the mech boys as they crowd around, pointing at various indicators that they barely understand. They are forced to witness their own violation with no ability to respond. No capability for action, not even the release of unconsciousness to grant them mercy from this awareness. It is, quite literally, a waking nightmare, and for a custodian, a being whose entire existence has been defined by action, by agency, by the power to shape events through the application of overwhelming force. This helplessness is perhaps more terrifying than any physical torture could be. Gricket continues their examination, pulling at cables, tapping panels, occasionally striking the armor with their wrench in what might be affection, or might be an attempt at percussive maintenance. "We's got the thinking bits working, yeah? Now we just got to get the moving bits and the shooty bits to wake up too. Spark plug, checked them power lines. Maybe we's not feeding it enough juice. This thing's got to run on something special. Stands to reason a fancy git like this wouldn't work on regular power." The mechs begin their work with renewed enthusiasm, now that they have evidence that their efforts are bearing fruit. They route more power through the cables. They attempt to establish deeper connections to the Dreadnought's systems, probing into the network architecture with all the subtlety of Orks anywhere, which is to say, none whatsoever. And inside his golden prison, the custodian experiences every probe, every intrusion, as a violation of increasing intensity. Because those connections, those neural interfaces that link the warrior to the machine, work both ways. When the mechs push power through the system, the custodian feels it as pain. When they attempt to access motor control protocols, the warrior experiences it as their limbs trying to move without their conscious direction. Muscles that no longer exist, attempting to respond to signals that bypass the brain entirely. It's not agony in the traditional sense. There are no pain receptors to stimulate, no nerves to burn. But it's worse in its own way, a wrongness that bypasses physical sensation and strikes directly at the consciousness, making the warrior aware that their body, such as it is being manipulated by external forces. And through it all, the custodian is helpless. They try desperately to regain control, to force the systems to respond to their will rather than the Orks' crude manipulations. But the damage from the spatial anomaly has done its work too well. Primary command pathways are severed or damaged. Secondary systems are locked in diagnostic mode. The Dreadnought's machine spirit, normally a partner in the warrior's consciousness, is silent and unresponsive. Gricket continues their monologue, entirely unaware of or unconcerned by the suffering they're inflicting. Right, so we's got the thinking bits working, but the doing bits are still asleep. That's a problem, that is. Can't very well use this thing if it just sits there looking shiny. We's gonna need to bypass something, get the juice flowing proper like. Hey, Sparkplug, remember that time we got that Yumi tank working by just wiring the engine straight to the controls? Maybe we could try that. Boss, Sparkplug ventures, their voice tentative. That tank exploded after about 5 minutes of working. Yeah, but it was a really good 5 minutes. And this thing's way better built than some Yumi tank. Probably won't explode. Probably. The Custodian, despite everything, despite the violation and the pain and the utter helplessness, manages to feel something approaching relief at this exchange. If the Orks' attempts to activate the motor systems are as crude as their other efforts, there's a good chance they'll damage the systems badly enough that the Dreadnought will remain immobile. It's not a good outcome. They'll still be trapped and aware and subject to whatever the Greenskins decide to do next, but at least they won't be forced to watch as their own body is used as a weapon against other Imperials or desecrated in battle. But then Gricket says something that turns that small relief into fresh horror. Actually, wait. We's thinking about this wrong again. We don't need to get the whole thing moving. We just need to get one part moving, see how it works. Then we can figure out the rest. Let's start small. What's the simplest bit we can try to activate? One of the younger mechs pipes up. What about the fingers, boss? Those grabby bits on the end of the arm? Those gotta be simple, right? Just some pistons and gears. That's thinking, that is. Right, everyone back up a bit. Give me room to work. We's gonna see if we can make this thing's hand twitch. And the Custodian, listening to this exchange with growing dread, realizes what's about to happen. The mechs are going to activate individual motor functions. They're going to bypass the higher control systems and feed power directly to the servos and pistons that move the Dreadnought's limbs. And when they do, when they succeed in making the fingers move or the arm shift, or any part of the body respond to external commands, they'll have demonstrated not just that they can wake the Dreadnought, but that they can potentially control it. The implications are staggering and terrible. A Custodian Dreadnought under Ork control, even partial control, even just stumbling around under crude command inputs, is a weapon of terrible power turned against its proper purpose. But worse, far worse, is what it means for the warrior inside. To be forced to watch, to feel, as your own limbs move without your consent, as your weapons that should be sanctified instruments of the Emperor's will are aimed at his servants, is a degradation beyond anything the Custodian has ever been trained to endure. Gricket begins their work, and the Custodian can do nothing but watch and wait and hope that somehow, through some miracle, that the Emperor might grant even to one so far from his light, this nightmare will end before it gets worse. But in the grim darkness of the far future, miracles are in very short supply. The first movement. When metal obeys the wrong master, the workshop falls into an unusual silence as Gricket works, broken only by the occasional spark of a welding torch or the metallic clink of tools against armor. The other mechs have drawn back, giving their boss room but watching intently, their crude understanding of technology telling them that what's happening here is important, even if they can't articulate exactly why. Even the Gretchen have stopped their usual squabbling, sensing that this is a moment of significance. Gricket traces power lines with their remaining organic hand, following the pathways that their instincts tell them should lead to motor control systems. The Dreadnought's engineering is far beyond anything they've worked with before, elegant and sophisticated in ways that make even the finest Tau technology look crude by comparison. But the fundamental principles are still recognizable to an Ork brain genetically programmed to understand machines. Power comes in, power gets directed, parts move. It's just a question of finding the right connections. Right, the big mech mutters, more to themselves than anyone else. So we's got the main power trunk here, yeah? and that splits off into all these little branches, like roots on a tree but made of metal. Each one goes to something different. This big one, that's probably the legs, needs a lot of juice to move all that weight. These smaller ones, those got to be the arms and the grabbers. We wants the smallest one, the one what controls just the fingers. They find it, or at least they find something their instincts insist is it. A cable barely thicker than a human wrist, running from a power distribution node down into the Dreadnought's left arm. Gricket examines it thoughtfully, then looks around for an appropriate power source. What they settle on is a portable generator normally used to power welding equipment, its engine chugging away with the distinctive irregular rhythm of Ork engineering. "Right, so here's what we's gonna do," Gricket announces to their audience. "We's gonna hook this generator up to this cable here, give it some juice, and see if we can't make dem fingers move. If it works, we knows we's on the right track. If it doesn't work, or if something explodes, well, that's also useful information in it." The Custodian, watching this preparation with mounting dread, knows exactly what's about to happen. The systems that control the Dreadnought's hands are designed for fine manipulation, capable of grasping weapons or operating controls with surprising delicacy despite the machine's size. They're also redundantly protected, with multiple safeties to prevent accidental activation or external override. But those safeties assume sophisticated attempts at intrusion, not the brutally straightforward approach of just dumping raw power into the system and seeing what happens. Gricket connects the cables, using a combination of welding, hammering, and what can only be described as aggressive problem-solving to make the Ork generator's output plug-compatible with Imperial connection standards. It's a masterpiece of terrible engineering, the kind of solution that should immediately catch fire or short out or explode. And in any rational universe, it would. But the Ork Gestalt field is growing stronger, fed by the excitement of the gathered mechs, all of them believing that this should work, that their boss knows what they're doing. Reality, as it so often does in the presence of enough Orks, decides to bend rather than break. "Here we go, Den," Gricket says, reaching for the generator's throttle. "Everybody step back, just in case. On three, yeah? 1, 2, 3. They crank the throttle wide open. The generator roars, its output suddenly dumping into the Dreadnought's systems with all the subtlety of a grenade. And for the Custodian, the result is immediate and overwhelming. The sensation is like having your hand dipped in fire while simultaneously being frozen in ice, both at once, neither truly describing what's happening, but both contributing to an overall experience of wrongness so profound that it bypasses any normal pain response. The power floods into the control systems, bypassing the sophisticated regulators that normally modulate the servos, pouring into the actuators that move the fingers with brute force intensity, and the fingers move. It's not a smooth motion. The Dreadnought's left hand, which has remained clenched in a relaxed neutral position since the machine was shut down, suddenly convulses. The fingers splay wide, joints locking at maximum extension, then curl back in on themselves so tightly that the armored fingertips grind against the palm. The hand shakes. Servos screeching as they're forced to operate at power levels they were never designed for, the metal itself beginning to heat from the friction. The watching Orks erupt in cheers. From their perspective, this is a complete success. They made the golden machine move. They found the right connection, applied power in the right place, and got a result. The fact that the result is uncontrolled and appears to be damaging the machine doesn't register as a problem. Things breaking is just part of how Ork technology works. You fix things when they break, or you build new things from the pieces. That's the natural order. For the Custodian, the experience is indescribable horror. It's not just the pain, though that is considerable despite the disconnection between the mind and what remains of the body. It's the violation, the awareness that something is making the Dreadnought's limbs move without the warrior's consent, without even the warrior's awareness informing the movement. The hand is thrashing because raw power is being dumped into systems that have no directive, no purpose, just energy with nowhere productive to go. But even worse is what comes next, as Gricket notices the uncontrolled movement and makes a decision. Ha, see that? It's working, but we's putting in too much juice, making it all twitchy-like. Let me try something else. We's gonna pulse the power on and off, see if we can make it move more controlled-like. They reach for the generator's throttle again and begin to cycle it. Power on, and the fingers extend. Power off, and they curl. Power on, extend. Power off, curl. On, off, on, off. Each cycle forcing the hand through its range of motion with mechanical precision. And the custodian is forced to watch, to feel, as this mockery of movement continues, their own limb being puppeted by an orc who views the whole thing as a successful experiment. It goes on for several minutes, Gricket experimenting with different power levels and timing, trying to find the right combination that produces smooth motion rather than jerky spasms. And slowly, horrifyingly, they start to succeed. The movements become more controlled. The fingers begin to respond to the power pulses in ways that approximate actual grasping motions. The big mech is learning, their orc instincts processing the information and adjusting their technique accordingly. Right, I think I'm getting the hang of this, Gricket says with satisfaction. Give me a few more hours, maybe a day or two, and I reckon I can get the whole arm working. Then the legs, then the weapons. We's gonna have ourselves a proper Dreadnought, we is, and it's gonna be the best thing we ever looted. The other mechs cheer again, already imagining the chaos they'll cause with such a weapon at their disposal. Even the Gretchen are excited, chattering amongst themselves about how they'll probably get to see it stomp around and shoot things, which is about as much entertainment as a Gretchen can hope for. But the custodian, trapped in their golden prison, experiencing every moment of this degradation with perfect clarity, can only endure. They try one more time to seize control, to force their will through the damaged command pathways and make the Dreadnought obey its proper master. But the attempt fails. As all the previous attempts have failed, the damage is too severe, the systems too compromised. The machine that should be an extension of the warrior's will has become a puppet for the enemy, and there is no escape from that awareness. In the custodian's long existence, they have known many forms of suffering. They have been wounded in battle, pain that would reduce normal humans to screaming wrecks, experienced and processed, and overcome through force of will. They have endured interrogation by enemies, sophisticated enough to try extracting information rather than simply killing. They have felt the slow degradation that comes with internment in the Dreadnought, the loss of humanity that accompanies each awakening and each return to sleep. But this is something new. This is helplessness, not just physical, but metaphysical. A violation of everything they are on a level that they have no framework for understanding or combating. They are a warrior who cannot fight, a guardian who cannot protect, a custodian who cannot fulfill their duty. And that realization, settling into their consciousness with the weight of absolute truth, is perhaps the cruelest torment the Orks could inflict, though the greenskins themselves don't even understand that they're inflicting it. Gricket disconnects the power feed, satisfied with the initial results. The Dreadnought's hand goes still, fingers locked in a half-curled position that the warrior inside cannot control. "That'll do for today," the big mech announces. "We's made good progress, yeah? Proved we can make bits of it move. Tomorrow we'll work on getting more bits moving. Maybe see if we can figure out how to make the guns shoot. This is gonna be proper brilliant, boys." The mechs disperse, heading off to their own projects or to the nearest place serving fungus beer, leaving the Dreadnought alone in the workshop. The lights dim as the various tools and equipment are powered down for the night cycle, such as it is in Orc society. And in the darkness, the custodian is left with their thoughts and the terrible knowledge of what tomorrow will bring. More testing, more violation, more helpless awareness as the Orcs learn to puppeteer the Dreadnought systems, turning a sacred instrument of the Emperor's will into a toy for greenskin amusement. And eventually, inevitably, The moment when Gricket succeeds in their goal, when the Dreadnought stands and walks and fights under Ork control, a golden warrior reduced to a mechanical slave. The Custodian cannot sleep. The stasis systems that would grant merciful unconsciousness are offline, damaged by the same anomaly that disabled the command pathways. They are forced to remain aware, to wait in the darkness, to contemplate the full scope of the nightmare they're living. And in that darkness, for perhaps the first time in their long existence, the warrior begins to understand true despair. Because even if rescue comes, even if their brothers somehow locate them and mount a recovery operation, the Custodian knows they will never be the same. The psychological trauma of this experience will mark them forever, a scar deeper than any physical wound. They will always remember what it felt like to be helpless, to be used, to have their sacred duty perverted by Xenos who couldn't even comprehend the blasphemy they were committing. This is the fate that awaits one who falls into Ork hands while locked in stasis, not a quick death in battle, which any warrior would accept with pride. Not even the slow degradation of internment that all Dreadnoughts eventually face, but something infinitely worse. Existence as a thing, a curiosity, a prize whose only purpose is to satisfy greenskin curiosity and provide ammunition for their next war. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes, in the darkest corners of that darkness, there are fates that make war look merciful by comparison. The Ork learning curve, innovation through catastrophe. What happens over the following days would be fascinating to an outside observer, in the way that a particularly catastrophic industrial accident is fascinating. The Mech Boys, led by Gricket's increasingly confident experimentation, make steady progress in understanding how to manipulate the Dreadnought's systems. But progress for Orks is a chaotic affair, marked by frequent setbacks, occasional explosions, and discoveries that happen as much by accident as by design. Day 2 begins with Gricket attempting to replicate yesterday's success with the left hand, this time working on the right arm. The process goes more smoothly, the big mech having learned from their previous attempts. They connect their power source, cycle the throttle, and watch with satisfaction as the Dreadnought's right hand goes through its range of motion. The movements are jerky and uncoordinated, more seizure than controlled action. But the Orks don't care about such details. The important thing is that it works. See that? Gricket addresses their gathered audience, which has grown substantially now that word has spread through the Ork settlement about the golden machine that moves when you zap it right. We's getting the hang of this. Tomorrow we'll tackle the arms proper, get them swinging, den the legs, and den we's gonna see about dem weapons. But an interesting thing happens as the mechs continue their work. They begin to notice patterns, consistencies in how the Dreadnought systems respond to their inputs. And their Ork brains, genetically programmed to understand technology, even if they can't articulate that understanding, start to build a crude mental model of how the machine functions. It's not accurate, not in any technical sense, but it's functional, which for Orks is all that matters. Right, so here's what I think, Gricket explains during a break, using their power claw to scratch diagrams in the workshop's dirt floor. This thing's got layers, yeah? At the bottom you got the juice, the power what makes everything run. Then you got the thinking layer, what decides where the juice goes. Then you got the moving layer, what actually makes stuff happen. We've been poking at the moving layer, forcing it to work without the thinking layer saying it's okay. That's why it's all twitchy. One of the other mechs, an ancient scarred specimen who goes by Dreadnought, peers at the diagrams thoughtfully. So what you saying, boss, is we's doing this backwards? We should be figuring out the thinking layer first, yeah? Make that work proper, then the moving bits will be easier. Exactly that. Problem is, the thinking layer's all locked up tight. We can get power into the moving bits because those are simple, just servos and pistons and stuff. But the thinking bits, that's all complicated tech priest gubbins what we don't understand. Yet. This is the moment where the scenario takes a turn from horrible to catastrophically worse. Because Dreadnought, who has been around long enough to loot technology from every major faction in the galaxy at least once, has an idea. And when old mechs get ideas, things tend to happen that reshape the local tactical situation in unpredictable ways. "Boss," Dreadnought says slowly, "what if we don't try to understand the thinking bits? What if we just replace them with our own?" The workshop goes silent. Even the Gretchens stop their constant scurrying to stare at Dreadnought, sensing that something significant has just been said, even if they don't understand what. Gricket turns to look at the old mech, their single bionic eye whirring as it focuses. "You saying we should rip out the Yumi control systems and put in Ork ones?" "Why not? We do it all the time with tanks and stuff. Take out the complicated bits what we don't understand. Put in simple stuff what we do understand. Make the whole thing Orky instead of Yumi. This is just a really big fancy tank, innit? Same principles should work." For the Custodian, listening to this exchange through the acoustic sensors, this proposal represents a new level of horror. What the Orks are suggesting is not just puppeteering the Dreadnought's existing systems, but completely replacing them. Tearing out the sophisticated Imperial technology, the neural interfaces and command hierarchies that have kept the warrior alive and conscious for centuries, and replacing them with crude Ork equivalents. The implications are staggering. If they succeed, if they actually manage to replace the Dreadnought's core systems with Ork technology, the Custodian's consciousness might not survive the transition. The neural interfaces that connect the brain to the machine are calibrated specifically for Imperial technology. Ork substitutes would be incompatible, might sever those connections entirely. The result could be death, or worse, a form of brain death that leaves the organic components alive, but the consciousness gone. A vegetative state maintained indefinitely by life support systems that don't understand that the mind they're sustaining no longer exists. But even if the Custodians somehow survive the transition, the result would be the warrior can't even properly conceptualize it. A Custodian Dreadnought controlled by Ork technology. A sacred instrument of the Emperor's will operated through crude mechanical systems and maintained by greenskins who view percussive maintenance as a legitimate repair technique. It's a blasphemy so profound that no Imperial doctrine has ever needed to address it, because the scenario was considered too unlikely to ever occur. Gricket considers Dreadnought's proposal carefully, which for an Ork means thinking about it for approximately 3 seconds before deciding it's a great idea. "Yeah, right, I can see that working. We've already got all the plans for building Death Dreads. Just got to scale them up a bit for something this size. And we can use some of the fancy Yumi bits where they're still useful. Just hook them up to our own control systems instead. Keep the guns, keep the armor, but make the insides Orky." "One problem, boss," Sparkplug ventures. "What about the thing inside? The Yumi what's piloting it? If we start tearing out the guts, we might kill him, and then the whole thing will just be a big metal statue, yeah?" This is perhaps the first time any of the Orks has explicitly acknowledged the existence of the pilot. They've known intellectually that there must be someone inside. All Dreadnoughts have someone inside. But they haven't really thought about that someone as a person, just as another component of the machine. Sparkplug's question forces them to actually consider the biological element. Gricket scratches at their metal-plated skull, thinking harder than they probably have in months. "That is a good point. Tell you what, before we start ripping things out, let's see if we can get the thing inside to talk to us. Might be useful, having a Yumi what knows how this all works. Plus, if we can talk to him, we can make sure we's not killing him when we do the surgery." The Custodian, hearing this, experiences a moment of hope so intense it's almost painful. If they can communicate, if they can make the Orks understand even a fraction of what they're dealing with, perhaps they can convince the greenskins to stop. Perhaps they can explain that what they're doing is not just damaging a machine, but torturing a warrior. That the proper course of action is to simply end the pilot's suffering, rather than continue this grotesque experimentation. But that hope dies quickly as the mechs begin their attempts to establish communication. Because while they're trying to activate the vocal synthesizers that would let the Custodian speak, their approach is, predictably, to just keep dumping power into various systems until something happens. And the vocal systems, sophisticated as they are also incredibly delicate. Too much power, delivered without proper regulation, and critical components burn out. Which is exactly what happens when Gricket connects their generator to what they think is the right interface. There's a brief crackle of static through the Dreadnought's external speakers. The Custodian, seizing the moment, tries desperately to force words through the system, to say something, anything, that might make the Orks understand. But the systems are already failing. Transistors melting under the surge, and what emerges is not language, but a horrific electronic scream, feedback and distortion, and the sound of delicate machinery being destroyed, all happening simultaneously. The Orks jump back in surprise, then start laughing. Because to them, that scream sounded angry, which means the Yumi inside is alive and mad about what's happening to their machine. And an angry enemy is funny. It's one of the fundamental truths of Ork existence. If someone's mad at you and you're winning, it's hilarious. Ha! Did you hear that? Gricket slaps their knee, which produces a metallic clang from the armor plating they've attached there. We really got 'em riled up, we did. That's good. That means they're still alive in there. That scream didn't sound like they was dying, more like they was angry like. So we's probably safe to start the surgery, long as we're careful not to wreck the important bits. And just like that, the Custodian's one chance at communication is gone. The vocal systems are burned out, destroyed by Ork crudeness and the warrior's own desperate attempt to use them. The silence that follows is absolute, and in that silence, the Custodian understands that there will be no reasoning with these creatures, no appeal to mercy or understanding. The Orks are going to proceed with their plan, because it seems like fun, and nothing the warrior can do will change that. Over the next several days, the mechs begin the long, painful process of retrofitting the Custodian Dreadnought with Ork technology. They're surprisingly methodical about it by Ork standards. Gricket insists on careful documentation, which in this case means having Gretchen draw crude pictures of what they're removing and from where, so they can put it back if they accidentally break something important. They start with non-critical systems, testing their approach on things that won't immediately kill the pilot if they're removed. Power distribution nodes get replaced with Ork equivalents, cruder but more robust. Targeting cogitators are bypassed in favor of simple optical sights welded to the weapons. The sophisticated gyroscopic balance systems are supplemented with additional bracing struts bolted directly to the frame. Each modification makes the Dreadnought less precise, less sophisticated, but also more in line with Ork understanding of how things should work. And through it all, the Custodian endures. They feel every modification, every replacement, as a piece of their connection to the machine is severed or altered. The Dreadnought is becoming less like an extension of their body and more like a prison that they happen to occupy. The controls stop responding to neural impulses, replaced by crude mechanical overrides that the Orks can manipulate from outside. The sensory feeds degrade as sophisticated sensors are removed and simple ones installed. It's death by degrees, the slow murder of everything that made the Custodian Dreadnought a synergy between warrior and machine. But because the mechs are being careful, because they're taking pains not to kill the pilot, the consciousness remains. The warrior is forced to witness their own transformation from the Emperor's finest into an Ork war machine, aware and helpless and unable to even express their suffering. The worst moment comes when Gricket, growing confident in their understanding of the Dreadnought's layout, decides to tackle the neural interface directly. They don't remove it, that would be too dangerous, but they install bypasses, crude Ork neuromechanical systems that intercept signals between the brain and the machine, filtering them through simple command protocols that the greenskins can override. It's brutal, invasive surgery, and while the mechs try to be careful, their understanding of human neurology is limited to what they've learned from building Def Dreads. The Custodian experiences the installation of these systems as a wrongness that goes beyond pain, beyond violation. It's the feeling of foreign objects pressing directly against what remains of their organic tissue. Metal and circuitry invading spaces that should be inviolate. And when the systems activate, when the Orks test them by sending simple commands through the new interfaces, the warrior feels their own body respond to instructions that didn't come from their mind. The right arm lifts, not because the Custodian willed it, but because an Ork pressed a button. The head turns, tracking a target that the warrior's own consciousness didn't select. The legs shift, taking the Dreadnought's weight in preparation for movement that should be impossible while the machine is still restrained by support frameworks. Gricket has succeeded. The Custodian Dreadnought, or what remains of it, is now under Ork control. The first steps, a warrior forced to march. The day the mechs get the Dreadnought standing on its own is cause for celebration throughout the Ork settlement. Word has spread about the Big Mechs project, and Orks from all over come to witness the spectacle. They gather in and around the workshop, jostling for position, arguing over who gets the best view, occasionally fighting each other just because that's what Orks do when they're excited and crowded together. The atmosphere is carnival-like, festive in the way that only Orks can manage, treating the degradation of the Imperium's finest as entertainment. Gricket stands at a newly constructed control station, a crude arrangement of levers, buttons, and dials that looks like it was assembled from the remains of 3 different vehicles, which it was. Cables run from this station to connection points all over the Dreadnought's frame, bypassing the sophisticated control systems and connecting directly to the motors and servos that move the massive machine. It's an incredibly crude solution, but that's exactly why it works. Where Imperial systems required proper authorization protocols and neural interface confirmation, Ork systems just need power and a signal telling them which way to move. "Right den, boys," Gricket announces, their voice booming over the crowd noise. "We've been working on this beauty for days now, getting all the bits hooked up proper. Today's the day we see if we can make the whole thing walk. Now, this is gonna be a bit rough, because we're still figuring out exactly how all the controls work. If it falls over, that's fine. We'll just prop it back up and try again. If it steps on anyone, well, that's what you get for standing too close, innit?" The gathered Orks cheer their understanding and agreement with this safety policy. A few of them scramble to better positions, not because they're afraid of being stepped on, but because they want a better view of what promises to be a spectacular display. Inside the Dreadnought, the Custodian is aware of all of this through the machine's sensors, which are among the few systems the Orks haven't significantly modified. They can see the crowd, hear the anticipation, feel the weight of their own body being supported by the gantry that's kept them upright during the modifications. And they know what's about to happen. After days of forced passivity, of watching as their sacred vessel was retrofitted with Xenos technology, they're finally going to move again. But the movement won't be theirs. It will be commanded by an Ork, executed through systems that bypass the warrior's will entirely. It's the ultimate violation, not just to be captured, not just to be modified, but to be used. To have one's body, however mechanical it might be, turned into an instrument that moves and acts without any input from the consciousness that should be controlling it. For a Custodian, bred and trained to be in perfect control of themselves at all times, it's a form of torture more effective than any physical pain. Gricket pulls the first lever. Somewhere in the Dreadnought systems, power flows. Actuators engage, and the Custodian feels their legs moving, taking the Dreadnought's weight as the gantry supports release. It's not a smooth motion. The Orks' control systems don't have the sophisticated balancing algorithms that normally keep a Dreadnought stable. Instead, they rely on simple pressure sensors and crude feedback loops that make every movement jerky and uncertain. The Dreadnought sways, nearly falls, catches itself at the last second as Gricket compensates at the controls. The crowd of Orks gasps, then cheers as the machine stabilizes. It's standing now, truly standing, supporting its own weight for the first time since the capture. And to the Orks, This is a triumph. They've tamed one of the Imperium's war machines, bent it to their will, proved that with enough determination and disregard for safety, anything can be made to work the Ork way. Ha! See that? Still standing we are. Now let's try some walking. This should be interesting. Gricket pushes another lever forward. The Dreadnought's left leg lifts, pistons screaming as they're forced to move faster than they should. The foot comes down hard, armor plating cracking against the workshop's floor, with enough force to crack the rockcrete. The machine tilts dangerously to one side, but Gricket compensates, shifting weight through the control systems, bringing it back to something approaching balance. Then the right leg. Same process, same violent motion, same barely controlled stumble. But this time, the Dreadnought doesn't nearly fall. It takes a step, crude, lurching, more like a drunk staggering than a warrior's measured stride, but unmistakably a step. The crowd goes wild, cheering and howling and firing weapons into the air in celebration, and the Custodian, forced to experience this mockery of movement, feels something inside themselves begin to break. Not physically, the organic components are still intact, still functioning, but psychologically, spiritually, something fundamental about who they are and what they believe themselves to be. Because this shouldn't be possible. A Custodian Dreadnought doesn't move without its pilot's consent. It's a partnership, warrior and machine, working in perfect synchronization, each an extension of the other. But that partnership has been severed, the connection broken, and now the machine moves according to Ork commands, while the warrior trapped inside can do nothing but watch. Gricket continues the demonstration, walking the Dreadnought in a small circle around the workshop floor. Each step is an improvement over the last, as the big mech learns to better coordinate the controls. By the 5th step, the movement is almost smooth. By the 10th, it's functional, if still clearly inferior to how the machine would move under proper control. But to the Orks, it's an absolute success. They've built themselves a golden Dreadnought, a looted war machine, unlike any they've ever captured before. Right, that's enough for today, Gricket finally announces, bringing the Dreadnought to a halt. We've proved it can walk. Tomorrow we'll work on the arms, get 'em swinging proper, den the weapons, and then, oh then, we's gonna take this thing into battle and show everyone what proper Orky engineering can do. The crowd begins to disperse, heading off to spread word of what they've witnessed. There will be boasting in the drinking halls tonight, Orks claiming they were there when the big mech made the golden giant walk. The story will grow with each telling, as Ork stories always do, until by next week they'll be saying the Dreadnought walked across the entire settlement and stepped on 3 separate mobs of rival Orks who were too slow to get out of the way. But one Ork remains behind as the workshop empties. Dreadnought, the old mech, who first suggested replacing the Dreadnought's control systems, approaches the now stationary machine with something approaching reverence. They reach out and place a gnarled hand against the golden armor, feeling the residual warmth from the motors. "I knows you can hear me," Dreadnought says, their voice surprisingly quiet for an Ork. "Dunno if you can understand Orkish, but I reckon you smart enough to figure out the meaning even if you can't follow the words. We's not trying to be cruel, you know. We's just Orks. We sees something interesting. We wants to take it apart, see how it works. Maybe put it back together in a way that makes more sense to us. That's how we is." The Custodian can't respond. The vocal system's still burned out from the earlier accident, but they listen, because there's nothing else they can do. "Da thing is," Dreadnought continues, "I've been doing this a long time, longer than most Orks last before something kills them, and I've looted a lot of stuff. Humi tanks, pointy-ear grav sleds, even one of them Tau battlesuits once. But this is different. I can feel it. This machine, it's not just bits and pieces slapped together. Someone put real work into it, real art. And I think maybe we's messing with something we don't fully understand." There's a long pause. Dreadnought seems to be struggling with something, which is unusual for an Ork. They're not a species given to internal conflict. "But here's the thing," the old mech finally says. Even if I thought we should stop, even if I went to Gricket and said we ought to give you back to the Humies, it wouldn't matter, because we's Orks. We don't give things back. We don't stop just because something's hard or dangerous or maybe wrong. We push forward. We make stuff work. We fight and build and break and fix until either we's winning or we's dead. That's the Ork way. Cragnut pats the armor one more time, then turns to leave. But they pause at the workshop entrance and look back. Sorry, I guess, for what that's worth, which probably ain't much. Coming from an Ork. And then they're gone, leaving the Custodian alone in the darkness of the workshop. The only sound, the quiet hum of the life support systems and the distant sounds of Ork celebration. The warrior has no capacity for tears, not anymore. Not with the modifications to the sarcophagus and the removal of anything not strictly necessary for basic survival. But if they could cry, they would. Not from pain, though there has been plenty of that. Not from anger, though they carry enough rage to burn worlds, but from the simple, overwhelming grief of understanding that this is now their existence, and there is no escape. Tomorrow, Gricket will make the arms work. The next day, the weapons. And then, inevitably, the Orks will take their looted prize into battle. The Custodian will be forced to watch through the Dreadnought's sensors as they fight not for the Emperor, but for greenskins, as their weapons that should be sanctified, instruments of his will, are turned against his servants. They will be an unwilling participant in battles they can't control, forced to witness atrocities they can't prevent, made complicit in desecrations they would die 1,000 times to avoid. This is the nightmare. This is what it means when Orks capture a sleeping Custodian Dreadnought. Not a quick death, which would be a mercy. Not even the slow degradation of proper captivity, which at least carries the possibility of eventual rescue or escape. But this limbo state, alive and aware, but stripped of all agency, turned into a thing rather than a being, a tool rather than a warrior. And in the darkness of the workshop, as the celebration continues in the distance and the Orks drink to their successful project, the Custodian finally understands what despair truly means. Because even if rescue comes, even if their brothers somehow extract them from this nightmare, they will carry these memories forever. The experience of being helpless, of being used, of having their sacred vessel perverted into an instrument of Xenos warfare. That stain will never wash clean. That wound will never fully heal. They are a Custodian no longer, not really. They are something new, something the Imperium has no name for because it was never meant to exist. A golden warrior broken not by enemy fire, but by enemy ingenuity, reduced from the Emperor's finest to a trophy, a curiosity, a demonstration of Ork technical prowess. The grim darkness of the far future has never looked darker than it does from inside this golden tomb. Theoretical outcomes. What happens next? As we step back from the immediate horror of the Custodian's situation and examine the broader implications of this scenario, we must consider the various ways this nightmare might resolve. None of these outcomes are good, you understand. This isn't a story where the hero triumphantly overcomes their adversity and emerges stronger for the trial. This is Warhammer 40,000. And in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes bad situations just get worse. But understanding the possible trajectories helps us grasp the full scope of what such a capture would mean for all parties involved. Outcome 1. The Orks use the Dreadnought in battle. The most straightforward continuation of our scenario is that Gricket succeeds completely in their modifications, and the looted Custodian Dreadnought is deployed in combat. The image is horrifying in its simplicity, a golden war machine marked with crude Ork glyphs and modifications, stomping into battle alongside mobs of boys and warbands of speed freaks. The Imperium's finest, reduced to just another piece of Ork equipment. In battle, the Dreadnought would be devastating. Even under Ork control, Even with its sophisticated systems replaced by crude alternatives, the fundamental engineering is still superior to anything the greenskins normally field. The Auramite armor would turn aside fire that would shred a deaf dread. The weapons, assuming the Orks figure out how to fire them or replace them with their own, would hit with terrible precision. And the sheer psychological impact of seeing a Custodian Dreadnought fighting for the enemy would be immense. Imperial forces facing this monstrosity would experience a crisis of morale that goes beyond normal combat stress. Custodian Dreadnoughts are symbols, representations of the Emperor's eternal protection. Seeing one turned against the Imperium would shake faith in ways that battlefield defeat alone never could. Even veteran soldiers, space marines who have faced horrors beyond counting, would falter at the sight. And in that moment of hesitation, the Orks would strike, turning what should be the Imperium's strength into their greatest weakness. Inside the Dreadnought, the Custodian would be forced to witness every moment of the carnage. They would see through the targeting systems as Imperial soldiers were obliterated. They would feel the Dreadnought's weapons firing, the recoil transmitted through the machine's frame. And they would be utterly unable to intervene, to stop what was happening, to even close their eyes to the slaughter. It would be the ultimate violation, not just of the warrior, but of everything they represented. This scenario would likely continue until one of three things happened. First, the Orks might eventually lose interest in their prize, as Orks sometimes do, and the Dreadnought would be abandoned or relegated to lesser battles. Second, Imperial forces might succeed in destroying the Dreadnought, though doing so would require tremendous firepower and the willingness to destroy what they should be trying to recover. Third, and perhaps most grimly, the Custodian inside might finally expire, their organic components failing after too long in such terrible conditions, leaving the Dreadnought as an empty shell that the Orks could continue using as a crude vehicle. Outcome 2. Imperial Rescue Operation. The alternative, and the one that hope would suggest, is that the Imperium successfully mounts a rescue mission before the Dreadnought is deployed in battle. Such a mission would be massive, requiring resources that the Imperium can barely spare. Multiple shield hosts of Custodians would need to be deployed, supported by perhaps entire chapters of Space Marines and extensive guard regiments. The operation would need to strike fast and hard, overwhelming the Ork defenses before they could scatter or hide their prize. If successful, the recovery would present its own challenges. The Dreadnought has been modified extensively, retrofitted with Ork technology that would need to be carefully removed before Imperial systems could be restored. The neural interfaces have been compromised, possibly damaged in ways that make them unrepairable, and the Custodian inside has been subjected to trauma that no amount of physical restoration can address. The most merciful outcome would be to offer the warrior the Emperor's peace, to end their suffering cleanly, acknowledging that what they've experienced has marked them in ways that make continued service impossible. This would not be a judgment against them. No one could question the honor of a Custodian forced to endure such circumstances, but it would be an acknowledgement of reality, that some wounds cannot be healed, and sometimes death is the only release from unendurable suffering. But mercy is not always available in the Imperium. If the warrior is recovered alive, and the damage to their organic components is repairable, they might be remanded and returned to service. The modifications would be painstakingly removed, Imperial systems restored where possible. But the psychological trauma would remain. Every time they awakened, every time they felt the neural interface connecting them to the Dreadnought, they would remember what it felt like when those connections were used against their will. The trust between warrior and machine would be broken, potentially forever. Such a warrior might serve for centuries more, technically functional but fundamentally compromised. They would fight with their usual skill, perhaps. They would uphold their oaths, certainly. But the joy of service, the sense of purpose that sustains a Custodian through millennia of duty, would be gone. They would be going through the motions of their duty while hollow inside, a living memorial to the price of failure. Outcome 3. The Dreadnought becomes an Ork icon. Perhaps the darkest possibility is that the looted Custodian Dreadnought becomes famous among Ork kind. Not just a successful project, but a legendary one, spoken of in Ork gatherings across the galaxy. The big mech who figured out how to make it work would gain tremendous prestige, potentially enough to launch their own surge. And other mechs, hearing the story, might start actively seeking out dreadnoughts to loot, viewing them as the ultimate technical challenge. In this scenario, the individual tragedy of one Custodian becomes a broader threat to the Imperium. If Orks begin specifically targeting dreadnoughts for capture and conversion, if they develop techniques for cracking their systems and implementing their own controls, then one of the Imperium's most precious resources becomes a liability. Every dreadnought deployed carries the risk not just of being destroyed, but of being turned, of becoming another trophy for greenskin mechs to boast about. The psychological impact on dreadnought pilots would be profound. They already accept that their existence is one of endless war interrupted by dreamless sleep. But to add to that, the possibility of capture, of being used against their own kind, of experiencing the specific horrors we've detailed in this scenario that would be almost unbearable. Some might refuse interment entirely, choosing death over the possibility of such a fate. Others might request fail-safes, dead man switches that would destroy the sarcophagus if certain conditions were met. And for the Custodian whose capture sparked this new Ork interest, there would be a special kind of horror. Not only would they have experienced personal violation and suffering, but they would have become the catalyst for a broader pattern of such violations. Their capture would have taught the Orks something they should never have learned: that dreadnoughts, even Custodian dreadnoughts, can be broken and repurposed with sufficient effort. Outcome 4. The Mechanicus becomes involved. One possibility we haven't yet explored is what might happen if the Adeptus Mechanicus learns of this situation in detail. The tech priests of Mars are fanatically protective of ancient technology, viewing each piece as sacred to the machine god. A Custodian dreadnought represents some of the finest engineering from the age of the Imperium's founding, incorporating technologies that even the Mechanicus cannot replicate. Learning that such a machine has fallen into Ork hands and been modified with Xenos technology would provoke a response that goes beyond normal military considerations. A Mechanicus expedition to recover the dreadnought would be driven not by mercy or honor, but by the theological imperative to recover sacred technology. They would pursue the Orks relentlessly, utilizing every resource at their disposal, from Skitarii legions to Titans if necessary. And they would brook no compromise. The dreadnought must be recovered, and the tech heresy of its modification must be cleansed. When finally recovered, the Mechanicus would face a difficult decision. The dreadnought has been contaminated by Xenos technology, its sacred systems replaced or modified in ways that violate the sacred templates. Some tech priests would argue for complete restoration, stripping away all Ork modifications and returning the machine to its original configuration, regardless of the time and resources required. Others would argue for destruction, that the corruption is too deep, and the only proper response is to reduce the entire machine to its component atoms. As for the pilot, the Custodian trapped inside, the Mechanicus view would be complicated. On one hand, the consciousness of a warrior who served at the Emperor's side is itself sacred, worthy of preservation. On the other hand, that consciousness has been subjected to Xenos influence, potentially compromised by prolonged exposure to Ork systems. The more radical elements of the Mechanicus might argue that the organic components should be removed and studied, the pilot's brain preserved in stasis, while they determine whether the consciousness within can be trusted. This would, of course, be its own form of horror. To be rescued from Ork captivity, only to become a subject of Mechanicus experimentation, trapped in a different kind of prison, locked away for study and analysis, rather than granted the peace they've more than earned. In some ways, it might be worse than the Ork workshop, because at least the greenskins didn't understand what they were doing to the pilot. The Mechanicus would know, would be fully aware of the suffering they were inflicting, and would proceed anyway in service to their interpretations of machine spirits and sacred technology. The broader implications, what this scenario teaches us. As we near the end of this nightmare examination, we need to step back and consider what this scenario reveals about the Warhammer 40,000 universe and the nature of warfare in the grim darkness of the far future. First, and most obviously, it demonstrates the fundamental vulnerability that exists even in the Imperium's greatest assets. Custodian Dreadnoughts represent the absolute pinnacle of Imperial military technology, combining ancient engineering with the finest warriors humanity has ever produced. They should be invulnerable, unstoppable, immune to the kind of degradation we've described. But the reality is that nothing in 40K is truly invincible. Given the right circumstances, given sufficient catastrophic failure and terrible luck, even the Emperor's finest can fall. And when they fall, the consequences are proportionately catastrophic. Second, the scenario highlights the particularly cruel nature of Ork warfare. Chaos is deliberately malicious, seeks to cause suffering for its own sake. Tyranids are a mindless, consuming force. Terrible, but at least comprehensible in their simplicity. But Orks are something different. They don't intend cruelty, don't even understand it as a concept. They're just being themselves, following their instincts and their genetic programming. But the result of that innocence, if we can even call it that, is sometimes worse than deliberate malice, because there's no possibility of appealing to mercy or reason. You can't make an Ork understand why what they're doing is wrong, because wrong is not a category they operate with. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this scenario demonstrates the psychological cost of the Imperium's determination to never waste resources. The decision to intern mortally wounded warriors in dreadnoughts, rather than granting them the rest they've earned, stems from practical necessity. The Imperium needs every warrior it can field, needs to extract maximum value from every resource, even if that resource is a consciousness that should be allowed to rest. But as this nightmare scenario reveals, that utilitarianism has a dark side. By creating warriors who can be awakened and used over and over again across centuries, the Imperium has also created warriors who can suffer in unique and terrible ways that a warrior who simply died in battle would never have to endure. The Custodian in our scenario didn't choose this fate. They chose to continue serving when given the option of interment, certainly. But they made that choice assuming certain conditions would hold, that they would fight for the Imperium, that they would be awakened by their brothers, that their service, however long and difficult, would have meaning and purpose. None of those conditions are met in Ork captivity. The warrior is still serving, in a sense. They're still fighting, technically, but it's a mockery of service, a perversion of everything they believed their duty meant. And finally, this scenario reveals something about hope and despair in the 40K universe. In most stories, even dark ones, there's an assumption that things can get better, that heroic effort can overcome adversity, that good can triumph even if at terrible cost. But in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes that's simply not true. Sometimes bad situations just become worse. Sometimes there is no escape, no rescue, no redemption. Sometimes you're just trapped, aware and suffering, with no prospect of release except the eventual failure of the systems keeping you alive. That's the ultimate horror of this scenario. Not the violence, though there's plenty of that. Not the violation, though that's certainly present. But the hopelessness, the understanding that this is now existence and will continue to be existence until something breaks that can't be fixed. For a warrior bred to be perfect, trained to overcome any challenge, genetically engineered to never give up, that realization of absolute helplessness is perhaps the cruelest fate imaginable. The Custodian in our scenario will eventually die. The organic components will fail, or the Orks will make a mistake that damages them beyond recovery, or Imperial forces will be forced to destroy the Dreadnought to prevent it from being used against them. But until that moment comes, the warrior exists in a limbo state worse than death, and with no promise of eventual peace. They are a consciousness trapped in metal, forced to witness their own desecration, unable to act or resist, or even properly express their suffering. This is what it means when Orks capture a sleeping Custodian Dreadnought. This is the nightmare that lurks at the edge of possibility in a galaxy where anything, no matter how unlikely, will eventually happen, given enough time and space and the cruel mathematics of probability. Conclusion. Lessons from the darkness. We've journeyed together through what might be one of the darkest scenarios in the already grim Warhammer 40,000 universe. We've examined in excruciating detail what happens when the Imperium's finest falls into the hands of its most unpredictable enemy. We've watched as sophisticated technology is retrofitted with crude Xeno systems. We've experienced, through the lens of our hypothetical Custodian, what it means to be aware and powerless, to be used as an instrument against everything you've sworn to protect. This hasn't been an easy journey. The nature of this scenario requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, about suffering, about the ways in which existence itself can become a form of torture when the right conditions align. But it's also been an important examination, because these dark possibilities are part of what makes the 40K universe compelling. In a setting where there is only war, where the best possible outcome is often just a slower path to inevitable defeat. Understanding the full scope of potential horror helps us appreciate why victory matters, why every battle won is precious, and why the warriors who fight them deserve honor even when, especially when, they fall. The scenario we've explored exists at the intersection of several key elements that define Warhammer 40,000. The Imperium's dogged determination to waste nothing, exemplified by the practice of interning mortally wounded warriors in dreadnoughts. The Orks' combination of savage enthusiasm and intuitive technical understanding, which allows them to loot and repurpose technology they don't truly comprehend. The cruel indifference of the universe itself, where catastrophic accidents can occur without malice or intention, simply because probability eventually catches up with everyone. And the psychological dimension of warfare, where the greatest suffering sometimes comes not from physical wounds, but from existential ones, from the violation of fundamental assumptions about who you are and what your existence means. For those who create content about 40K, whether through fiction, tabletop gaming, or discussion and analysis, this scenario offers rich material for exploration. It demonstrates that the horror of the setting isn't just about the scale of violence or the body count of battles. It's about the personal cost, the individual suffering, the moments where a single consciousness confronts the vast and uncaring machinery of war and finds itself ground down by forces it cannot control or even fully understand. For those who simply enjoy the setting, this examination hopefully provides new perspective on the dreadnoughts you see on the tabletop or read about in novels. Each one isn't just a powerful unit or a plot device. It's a person, or what remains of one, making choices about what they're willing to endure in service to something larger than themselves. And understanding that personal dimension makes the setting richer, makes the victories sweeter, and the defeats more bitter, makes the grim darkness feel like something more than just an aesthetic choice. As we close this examination, I want to acknowledge that this has been a particularly dark journey, even by the standards of a channel dedicated to Warhammer 40,000 content. If you've made it this far, you've demonstrated the kind of fortitude that would make even a guardsman proud. You've confronted nightmare scenarios and contemplated suffering that would break most beings. And hopefully you've come away with a deeper appreciation for just how terrible existence can be in the far future, and why the warriors who fight to protect humanity from such fates deserve remembrance. Remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But within that war, within the endless grinding machine of violence and death, there are still individual stories. Still moments of honor and sacrifice and terrible suffering. The scenario we've explored is just one possibility among countless billions, but it represents something important about the setting. It reminds us that the 40K universe isn't just about armies clashing and worlds burning. It's about people, or what remains of them, trying to maintain some sense of purpose and identity in circumstances that would strip both away. If you found value in this exploration, if it's given you new perspective on the setting, or sparked your imagination about the darker corners of the 40K universe, then consider supporting the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into Warhammer lore. Share this with friends who enjoy exploring the grimdark aspects of the setting, who appreciate examinations that go beyond surface-level descriptions of battles and technology. And remember, as horrifying as this scenario is, as much as it reveals about the capacity for suffering in the far future, it's also a reminder of why the Imperium fights. Because the alternative, the possibility that more warriors might face such fates, that more servants of the Emperor might be perverted into instruments of his enemies, is unacceptable. Every battle won, every threat eliminated, every day that humanity survives is a day when scenarios like this remain hypothetical rather than real. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But even in that darkness, even in the worst possible circumstances, the human spirit endures. Broken, perhaps. Scarred, certainly. But enduring nonetheless, until the very last light fades and all that remains is silence. Thank you for joining me on this journey into nightmare. May the Emperor protect you from ever experiencing anything like what we've explored here. For the Emperor, always.